Good morning, everyone, and welcome. This webinar is brought to you by Strategies 2.0, a statewide collaborative funded by the California Office of Child Abuse Prevention. Today's webinar is Trauma-Informed Mindfulness, Movement, and Self-Care for Family Wellness and Providers. The webinar is scheduled from 10:30 until 12 o'clock noon. I'm Carrie Collins, today's facilitator, and my role today is to introduce the topic and the presenter, keep track of time, and help the presenters and participants in any way that you may need. So in a moment, I will introduce the presenter to you, but first I want to cover a few of the webinar guidelines. So all of you have a little red arrow that if you push that arrow, it controls your toolbar so that you can hide it and it won't interfere with what you're seeing on the screen. You have joined us today either by the telephone or by your microphone and speakers on your computer. Sometimes the sound is better on your telephone. You have plus a 2-number PIN with a pound sign that you need to enter, because if you ask a question and you want to be unmuted, we can't unmute you unless you've entered this PIN number. We're going to encourage you to use the chat box today. So if you have any questions for Schuyler, if you will enter those into the chat box, Schuyler will be addressing questions at the very end of the presentation. If you would like to be unmuted and ask the question yourself, just push on the little hand, and my colleague Alma will see your little hand up, and so then she will go in and unmute you, and you can ask the question yourself. So in order to limit all the outside noise, I have muted all of you, so it's not necessary for you to mute yourself. It says we lost sound. Can you not hear me out there? Hello? My sound is not good. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to be turning this over to Schuyler in just a moment. So hopefully, I'm getting a lot of response that my sound is fine. I hope all of you will be patient today as we go through this, because sometimes sound does go in and out. So hopefully everybody will be able to hear what they need to hear. So today's webinar is Trauma-Informed Mindfulness, Mindful Movement, and Self-Care for Family Providers. And this is being presented by Schuyler Bright. Schuyler is a holistic trauma recovery specialist, and there's a lot of letters by her name, and you can all see Schuyler on the screen. I'm going to be turning this over to her in just a moment. So let me just tell you a little bit about our presenter. Schuyler Bright has taught movement to thousands since 2003, and trauma-informed mindfulness, mindful movement, and self-care since 2011. In 2011, Schuyler began teaching at a local domestic violence shelter and has slowly extended her service to include the local homeless shelter and homeless day center, CalWorks clients and IHSS providers, Sierra County Drug Court and Mental Behavioral Health, the Wayne Brown Correctional Facility, I think it's Cheris Youth, if I said that wrong, Schuyler can correct me, Youth Center for At-Risk Youth, and is developing mindfulness and self-care programs for the Friendship Club, Sierra Nevada Children's Services, and for FEMA. Schuyler educates organizations on the benefits of trauma-informed care, especially in regard to the body and the relevance of the way that we take care of ourselves post-trauma. Schuyler also educates yoga teachers how to teach with trauma-informed principles, and teaches therapists and social workers to integrate the body in self-care practices for more complete and lasting healing. She plans to complete her PhD in somatic psychology from Meridian University when her youngest child is old enough to play with his older sister. Schuyler will share with you, but I'll share first that she's expecting a baby in September. Earlier in life, she taught skiing to kids aged 3 through 12 for 10 years, which helps her make her current work relevant and fun for younger audiences today. So what I would like to do is I am going to turn it over to Schuyler to be our presenter, and then she will take it from there. So just a really quick changing of the guard. And then Schuyler, I am going to turn it over to you. I am going to mute myself and Alma. I'm going to mute myself, and you take it from here.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Schuyler Bright, and thank you, Carrie, for the lovely introduction. And as you see on the screen listed, some of my credentials. I wanted to share some of a more personal story myself. I've come to believe in strength and vulnerability, though there is perhaps much to judge about my story, and I hope you can appreciate the relevance to the subject matter today. So, and before I even dive into that, since I'll be going just a little bit into my story, I want to provide a trauma disclosure. This is a trauma-informed class, and I expect that most of you, I believe, are professionals and are working with people with trauma. And I also understand that triggers just happen when people are reminded through sensations, physical sensations, emotional sensations, through any of the 5 senses. So please just be aware we may be speaking about delicate subject matter at points, and I just encourage you to take time that you need, perhaps even integrating some of the recommendations that you might get later on. But the first recommendation I might give, if you find yourself experiencing a traumatic reaction, is just to press your hands together or press your hands into something solid, your legs or your desk, and just to reorient back to the present moment, and that whatever I'm talking about will be over soon, and that it's not happening currently. So just a reminder, also lengthening the exhale. I'll talk about that a little bit later. If you start to notice yourself getting hyper aroused, that's a really good way to just come back to grounding. So again, I'm Schuyler Bright, and I'm going to dive into earlier in my life. As a teen, I experienced several traumas that I won't share the full disclosure, I suppose, for brevity's sake, but that I tried to numb myself from feeling with alcohol and other self-destructive behaviors. After about 20 years exploring alcoholism through college, 10 years of postgraduate education, owning a business, and a car crash that probably should have ended my life, I realized that something needed to change. After years of working with the body, I finally connected my story and my traumas to my alcohol addiction through therapy and Ayurvedic self-care and voracious reading on addiction. I realized what I have been teaching for so many years was not only relevant to others with trauma, but central to healing, because it combines and brings together the body and the mind. And what started as providing service in all the places that Carrie mentioned that I teach, from the domestic violence shelters to the jail and drug court currently, I will say has developed into a self-sustaining life and a field in and of itself, as recognized in Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. Bessel van der Kolk is known as one of the fathers of trauma recovery and parents of trauma recovery. And he writes about yoga and the benefits of yoga for reducing post-traumatic symptoms for trauma. I would say that my experience has driven my compassion and my accessibility, so that people who I'm teaching, especially in jail or youth, don't see me as some person on a pedestal, or that I'm putting myself on a pedestal, but rather really helps to humble me, as well as to be able to help people feel more comfortable and maybe even feel like sharing their story, which is really potent. So, and my mission is to bring this really uncomplicated but often forgotten work into the places that it isn't currently and is so deeply needed. So, moving on to the next slide, I want to just present a brief outline as to what we'll be covering today, starting with the microcosm of the personal effects of trauma, and then widening the lens to encompass the societal effects of trauma. Moving then from problem to solution, treatment, discussing top-down or bottom-up. If you're not familiar with those terms, you will be after I cover them. And the window of tolerance. Now, you see a little example of my humor there. Window of tolerance will go into a fair bit of detail with, but just to introduce the subject, you can imagine, maybe this has happened to you or some of your clients, you feel like perhaps, or your clients or students feel like you are in the middle of a storm. Even though you're in a building, you feel like you are just being swept away, fully overwhelmed, and just barely hanging on. So we'll give you some tools in this hour to be able to help you learn that you have control over how open those windows are, and that we can begin to feel that we can be protected from the storm, and that we then begin to learn how to not be triggered quite as often, so not everything feels like it's cutting like a knife, and that we don't remain triggered quite as long, that we can recover our center more quickly. And I'll be introducing that by covering a few. There are many trauma-informed principles, and but we'll just introduce probably the three most, I'd say, important, and then 3 modes of a solution base. And everybody's heard the phrase, practice makes perfect. I would say that practice makes more practice, and eventually, if you practice it 100% of the time, it works 100% of the time. We just only have so much energy for change and for commitment to self-care. So the amount that you practice what you learned today is going to give you the amount of healing that you might experience from that. So I just want to suggest that practice makes healing. All right. Diving in to personal effects of trauma. So I mentioned a little bit about hypervigilance. I want to give a little example. Perhaps you know someone, or perhaps you do tend to take things personally. That would be an example of hypervigilance in terms of perhaps always looking for threats. So I'll just give you an example of Joel. Happens to be my husband. And he was abused by his father and his brother early in life. And he still, even through lots of therapy, he still continues to see threats where there may not be any in his marriage, as well as on Facebook, which he is a habitual user. And you can see that. You can see his little boy right there out in the open. And I can see it. Not everybody can see it. So that's just one example of hypervigilance, just constantly being on alert. We'll go into that a little bit more in terms of physical responses to that shortly when we get into the window of tolerance. Hypovigilance would be an example of a rape victim who is in a dangerous situation. It goes, say, to the bar and meets someone who is not necessarily looking for the hypovigilance, where you're not really processing the threat and you're not doing anything to escape it. So, and that is present in both the nervous system and the mind. Then the first four symptoms are common to everybody who has trauma. Dissociation, it can range from just simply checking out, like right now maybe you're hearing me, but you're thinking about what you forgot to do this morning. That's one example. A second example would be heightened arousal from the perspective of the nervous system and just a feeling of threat and actually being in threat. If something really horrible is happening to your body and your spirit or some part of your psyche lifts up onto the ceiling and is looking down on your body, that's also considered dissociation. Denial would be what most people, I would say, are in most of the time. We all have experienced trauma on some level, some sort of overwhelming experience. We'll get into definitions in just a moment. But frequently denial occurs because we've all been told to just stop crying or keep a stiff upper lip. Whatever you've been taught, it's usually from discomfort from people around you to not share what is really true in your mind and heart. And so you learn to stuff our emotions and to shrug off whatever horrible thing has happened to us. So we experience denial. Well, lots of people experience denial. There's also reenactment, and reenactment is the magnetic connection to repeat our lessons, if you will, with different faces, different people, different situations, and we are just drawn to have to learn our lessons over and over and over again. And it's really the psyche's brilliant way of giving us an option to discharge our pent-up traumatic energy in our body. But if we are not, don't have new tools or resources, frequently we just end up being re-traumatized. The next couple bullet points there include insomnia, which is not applicable to everybody necessarily, but frequently if something overwhelming happens to us, we process those moments in the first couple hours of sleep, first few hours of sleep, and if we can't process it and resolve it in our subconscious, then we end up lying awake for much of the night. So beyond that, the turbulent emotions from trauma, such as depression, anger, and anxiety, can contribute to that insomnia, as well as turbulence in a relationship, or just having too much projection, too much anger, too much for your partner to deal with, and so that often ends relationships. However, the relationship might also be the cause of the trauma. It's another scenario. Next slide. Looking to the longer term effects of trauma. So there's chronic pain is just one thing to recognize among all of the others in the list here. Those turbulent emotions, anger, depression, anxiety, which often come all together, also leads to poor self-care. In addition, just to the habit that, or maybe not a habit, but it's common to everybody who experiences trauma, we often ask, why me? Why did this happen to me? And we look to things sometimes that we did blaming ourselves or someone else to figure out why this could have happened to us. And so we often come to the answer that we deserve punishment. And that often leads to things like poor self-care, self-destructive choices, which can lead to the whole gamut of disease. And these are just to mention a few common ones. Addiction, doesn't matter to a substance, could be to caffeine, could be to a behavior, could be to other classic substances, could be to shopping. You name it, it's covered. Even obsessive compulsive disorder would tend to fall into a compulsion-like addiction. Autoimmune disease would be another thing that has been linked to trauma. Learning disabilities, absolutely, would be created when there's an overwhelming experience that you can't process. Having other things coming in at the same time are just not going to end up being processed. Personality disorders. I just listened to something on the radio the other day that was talking about the first female punk band, and the woman in the band was saying, I think we all had personality disorders back in the 70s. They didn't have the names for those sorts of things like ADHD or autism or Asperger's. It wasn't diagnosed yet. It wasn't created. Those names weren't created yet. So that definitely falls under that, as well as the hormonal and nervous system imbalances that create those manifestations of the personality disorders. As well, further down the line, of course, would be diseases like cancer and Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's being really interesting in terms of a recent-ish study done by Harvard on their football players when they experience a traumatic brain injury, and they realized that there's a plaque created in after the first hour, the first few hours after a concussion. There's a plaque created in the brain that matches identically the plaque that creates Alzheimer's, or that is found in Alzheimer's patients. So one might expand that to consider that perhaps all trauma and undigested experience might settle into the tissues of both the brain and the body. For example, atherosclerosis, where the blood vessels begin to be blocked to the heart and the rest of the body, as well as arthritis. It is a plaque that is created in the joints, as well as candida, a systemic sort of undigested toxic material that might suggest that if we digested our food better, this is underlining key here to my later bits on self-care, if we were better able to digest our food, didn't have so much plaque in our body, that there wouldn't be so much to stick to, so much stickiness for trauma when there is new undigested material coming in, or new overwhelming material coming in. So just a thought to plant in your mind. Societal effects of unresolved trauma. You probably all heard the phrase, when one person is sick, the whole village is sick. While we are not really in a village so much anymore, we are in a nation and a world that I suppose you could argue that we are sick. I would say we're sick with trauma, unprocessed, unresolved trauma. And while chronic pain may drive the opioid epidemic, all the other diseases drive the rest of the medical insurance industry strain. As well, unresolved trauma, an inner sense of isolation and desperation, may lead people to commit violence against people they love or think they love, themselves, suicide, domestic violence, or, as we're seeing increasingly in the news, mass shootings, which strains the justice system and correctional institutions from the local to the federal level to the United Nations and NGOs. I thought you might appreciate this little picture of the steam rising off this woman's head. Perhaps you know someone who may have felt like that sometime in their life. And just to brag a little bit, I was actually there taking that picture on the right at the UN in 2012. So it's at the Commission on the Status of Women. So, definition we get to. Let's all take a deep breath just at this moment and lengthen the exhale. Just a deep breath in and slow down the exhalation. So I know this is a lot of information and it's just starting. So, trauma is the essence or the lesson of what we're supposed to get from this, and allow ourselves to let go of or let be or release the rest. So this just ends up in us feeling like we've had it up to here and we can't learn one more thing or we'll be over the top. What this does is results in a lack of a sense of agency, kind of like Ritalin overwhelms the nervous system. It's essentially legal speed, but it overwhelms the nervous system to a point of shutdown. So it robs one's sense of I can, leaving us to feel that we are unworthy and will allow our boundaries to hopelessly be run over, or will result in behaviors that lash out. Resilience would be the opposite of trauma. Resilience is an experience of agency, of yes, I can, of courage and hope that one can overcome challenges. It is a result of a later exposure to trauma and betrayal. As said by Bessel van der Kolk, who I mentioned earlier, one of the fathers of trauma recovery. And just to explain that a 5-year-old doesn't have the kinds of resources that a 35-year-old does. Perhaps if you have your first divorce when you're 35 and no big T traumas have really ever hit you before, divorce can absolutely be traumatic. So, and then whether or not betrayal was involved, especially from a primary caregiver, for example, being hurt while being told, I'm doing this because I love you, that builds a belief that love has to hurt. And so in a sense that leads to not being able to A, recognize facial expressions very well, and B, not really trusting anybody because love hurts. Moving into the next slide. So I mentioned top-down interventions in terms of treatment. So this is from Pat Ogden's Trauma and Body. Top-down cortically mediated techniques typically use cognition to regulate affect and sensory motor experience. Sensory being incoming information through our senses, motor being our outgoing information through the ways that we can maneuver the things around us. Excuse me. Focusing on meaning making and understanding. This is what we go to therapy for, to talk therapy for generally. The entry point is the story, and the formulation of a coherent narrative is of prime importance. Bottom-up approaches, the body's sensation and movement, and I'll mention here also breath, and included in sensation would be pain, tension. These are the entry points, and changes in sensory motor experience are used to support self-regulation, which, how often is self-regulation taught even in therapy, but certainly not in schools. How amazing would it be if we could teach our students how to self-regulate, how to calm down when they are upset in a more effective way. Also memory processing and success in daily life. So ultimately, going back, this is to say that going back and remembering the story is not necessary in recovering from trauma. It might be helpful in understanding why you react a certain way to a certain stimulus, but ultimately you want to make steps in terms of your daily life, in terms of how you are able to deal with your stresses on a regular basis and not be so triggered all the time, for example. For yourself and for your clients, just think for a younger person who's experienced 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 adverse childhood experiences already at 7 years old, they're going to have even more difficulty processing because they don't have any foundation. So these practices are a lot about building up foundation. By using the body then, starting again in the middle, by using the body rather than only cognition or emotion as a primary entry point and avenue of exploration of traumatic experience, the effects of trauma on the body and on procedural learning are addressed directly. Procedural learning being how we learn to do things, how we learn to tie a shoelace, how we learn how to treat your mother, how to treat women, how to treat your father and men, how to deal with stress. All of these things would be considered procedural learning. So also from Pat Ogden's Trauma in the Body, this is a image of the window of tolerance. Now you could put this on a scale. On the bottom would be 1, on the top would be a 10. So if I am about a 1 or a 2 or a 3 maybe, I'm going to have relative absence of sensation, a numbing of emotions, disabled cognitive processing, and reduced physical movement. So just considering that example of the rape victim in immediate threat and not recognizing the threat and not doing anything to remove herself from it. The window of tolerance would be where our, I'll say, prefrontal cortex is online, where our thinking brain is online, where we are able to recognize threat and when there's actually threat and so on. This is our optimal arousal zone. Hyperarousal zone would be in the realm of 7 to 10 perhaps, and those are not solid numbers. I'll talk about that in just a moment. Where in hyperarousal we have increased sensation, emotional reactivity, hypervigilance, again, not looking for threats, intrusive imagery such as flashbacks, and disorganized cognitive processing, as in not making exact sense of what's happening. So you might see something, but you think it's due to something else rather than what it's really due to. So, and in terms of that picture of the window earlier, that's not, the connection is a lot around your control of how open the window is, how exposed you feel, and how triggered you get. So some days you might have a really wide open window and you really don't feel like you're in the middle of a storm. And other days that window of tolerance is narrowed to right around a 5, and you're feeling still in the middle of the storm. So these practices are just to show you how better to control opening and closing the window, as well as how to return back to center if you are triggered. Wouldn't it be great to know when your students or clients are triggered? So you've all seen examples of your clients either in sympathetic or parasympathetic arousal, and that would be either hyper or hypo. So sympathetic would be hyper arousal, parasympathetic would be hypo arousal. These are the two, I'll say, 2 of 3 nervous systems. If you went to school and took anatomy and physiology probably even more than 5 years ago, you would only think that there are 2 nervous systems. In the next slide, I will introduce a new theory called the polyvagal theory, or relatively new. And again, this sympathetic chronic arousal is the language of hypervigilance, which has the body language of shifty eyes, constantly looking around, constantly on alert. Rapid, shallow breathing, body leaning forward, tensed, restless leg movement, bopping your foot, and fast talking. Now, I know I'm doing a little fast talking right now, and that's just to get through everything that I wanted to bring for you today. But I would also tend toward fight or flight in general. Parasympathetic arousal, we've all seen this. Closed off body language. Yeah, prove it to me. Or yeah, you're not interesting. Yeah, you don't understand me. Not meeting the gaze. Crossed arms, sunken in the chair, crossed legs, distant sort of gaze, usually downcast. Collapsed, shallow breathing. Generally, it's like pulling teeth to get them to talk. We all have, you're probably thinking of someone just like you saw in your office yesterday. So this is a slide that you might want to look a little closer at. I realize that some things would be difficult to read on this. On the left-hand side is a map of the 3 nervous systems. This is a triune autonomic nervous system. This is a demonstration of the polyvagal theory. And definitely good to research more about this since we have such limited time today. The gold on the left is the sympathetic nervous system. The red is the parasympathetic nervous system. All of those nerves go toward all of the major organs that either wake up or shut down, and either shut down, or shut down and restore. We'll get to that in just a moment. And the blue, you can see, reaches the face, facial muscles, as well as innervates the heart. So this suggests some of the functions of that branch of the nervous system, which is recognizing facial expressions, which people who've experienced trauma frequently have trouble recognizing the difference between a happy face and a sad face or an angry face, and trouble connecting with their heart. Now, it's important to remember that these nervous systems all attach to different parts of our brain. The parasympathetic nervous system relates to the brain stem. This is the reptilian brain. This is the part of the brain that governs freeze and also rest and rebuild. And the midbrain is the sympathetic nervous system, which governs fight or flight. And as well, we'll talk about the normal and stress responses in just a moment. And then the forebrain, the prefrontal cortex, is what governs empathy, language choice, consideration of consequences. So, and you'll hear me repeat that a couple more times throughout our talk today. But generally, when we're triggered, that shuts down. That thinking brain shuts down, which is why if any of you teach WRAP, the Wellness Recovery Action Plan, that's all great stuff to have planned, as long as your thinking brain is online, as long as you're not triggered. Once you're triggered, you have to get that thinking brain back online before you can remember, oh yeah, I wrote down a plan on how to deal with this the next time it happened. So, I will say a high percentage, reading on the top underneath the normal functions of the autonomic nervous system, a high percentage of health conditions center on our autonomic nervous system, including immune system disorders, attention deficit conditions, psychosomatic issues, post-traumatic stress effects, and others. And just to go through a few things that each of these do very briefly. In the social nervous system, again, I mentioned there's language, there's breath and connection to the heart, there is facial recognition, there is empathy and choice. And the sympathetic nervous system, in normal function, this is like daily challenges, mobilization for daily challenges that includes daytime alertness and metabolism. Parasympathetic nervous system is, in a normal function, would be functional when we're sleeping or when we have a full belly. And these are the states of rest and rebuild, tissues that have been, or cells that have been damaged by stress. So, Then, in an abnormal situation, keep our story, then you will be able to still be present and empathize with other people in perhaps see where's safety and where's the danger and move toward the safety and help others to do the same. If you are so overwhelmed that that part of the brain is just out the window, then you'll go straight to fight or flight. So very frequently in a very stressful situation, you are not even thinking about necessarily where the exits are, but you are able to, unless it's part of your sort of muscle memory, if you will, your body will be orienting, orienting and respond in terms of assessing, can I overwhelm this threat, this predator by fighting it? Can I win this fight? And deciding yes or no and decide to flee. And can I outrun this predator, this threat? And then if that is overwhelmed, then that shuts down to the parasympathetic freeze and decides that the only way I'm going to live through this, let's take a deep breath, is by just playing dead or freezing in immobility. It could be, there are two kinds of immobility. One is a chosen immobility, and a second is you might want to escape, but your body cannot move. Catatonia and sleep disorders also fall into this stress response. I also want to read this thing just below the stress responses of the ANS. The higher nervous system arrangements inhibit or control the lower, and thus when the higher are suddenly rendered functionless, the lower rise in activity. So the brainstem is always going to be on, but if it is stuck on, then we end up being stuck and more or less immobile, maybe not as immobile as during the trauma, but feeling stuck and habitually just in that crossed arms and feeling like we don't have any control over the world around us for the rest of our lives. Or we might be stuck in sympathetic reaction, fight or flight, constantly looking for threats, because that we were once so overwhelmed that we didn't know what to do, and we're not going to let that happen again. So I realize this is a lot of information. Let's take another breath and slowly exhale. So moving into from the reasons why these solutions I'm about to suggest. Also, I did want to just go back one slide to mention that when I have taught restorative yoga since 2003, and I thought that it was the medicine that everybody needed because everybody was running in sympathetic fight or flight most of the time, not resting enough. And until I started teaching really traumatized people who were stuck in parasympathetic freeze. And that's when I realized that a more active style was really beneficial, but not necessarily to be starting off with that for people who've been dissociated and likely injured for much of their life. So we still want to start off making friends with the body and starting off slowly, and then building up to a more active practice with those folks. So there's a mode of treatment for each of these physically to do more active or more restful postures with breathing. We'll get into that again shortly, but just wanted to introduce that concept now. So, yes.
I just want to remind you that you are at the halfway mark. You're doing great.
Thank you. So some trauma-informed principles include creating a safe space is of utmost importance, including allowing the clients to choose how much they want to participate. So I teach at an at-risk youth center, and unfortunately they're all required to be there, and they actually get points off if they sit out, which I think is not great, but I'm not in charge of the way they run things. And even though they have so many staff, they don't have enough staff to remove some of the people who are feeling like not participating. And it does have an effect on the other people who are participating, because people don't generally like to be watched, but and might be magnetic for other people to want to play humbug too. But that is really important in terms of creating safety. If they're forced to do anything, then it's like being re-traumatized all over again. Reviewing a protocol for a safe practice if there is even one new student. And by a safe practice, I mean not just like telling people that this is a safe space, but telling them that everything I say is merely a suggestion, and that you will want to invite rather than instruct. You will want to let people know that they are in control of how long they're in any of the postures, how deeply they breathe. For example, how deeply we breathe is how deeply and how engaged we are in the present moment. So invite them to experience what you're offering, and just don't push it. And another most important principle is to not touch students without asking permission, and give them a protocol to decline anything that you might have to offer, whether it's touch, whether it's a scent like aromatherapy, or food, or whatever you might have to offer them. So that is the three most important things, I'd say, in terms of trauma-informed principles. There are probably 20 that we could go into more in depth if we had more time, perhaps in another webinar. But for now, I'm introducing the complementary care triad. Talk therapy would be a top-down therapy, and on either side would be mindfulness and mindful movement. Mindfulness can really be applied to anything. How we move, how we talk, how we take care of ourselves. So sensory self-care routines would be mindfully done as well, and can't be done any other way in general, because generally they require tuning in as opposed to, say, smoking a cigarette, which invites us to tune out. So again, with this healing in, we're healing with awareness. So mindfulness offers more awareness of self, and I'm just going to briefly mention the difference between, I'm going to say, self with a small s and a capital S. Is a small s self is constantly reaching out for, grasping for things to stuff, to make us feel better, to fill the void, if you will. The self with a capital S, you might be spiritual, you might not, but Henry David Thoreau has a lovely way of talking about the oversoul, that which connects all of us. So whether you believe in a god or a goddess, or a higher power, this self is connected to that and recognizes on some level that no one can teach you anything that you don't already know. Most important questions in your life you already know and just need to be reawakened or reminded of. So when we are in alignment with that, we don't need to stuff our senses so much. So mindfulness offers more awareness of self as the healing process begins. This gives us more autonomy and helps us to slow down and to trust in the process that we will learn what we need to learn when it's appropriate and when we're able to handle it. Slowing down to observe what we are allowing into our experience through our five senses. and to begin to become more subtly aware of the effect of the caffeine that we drink, of the movies that we watch, or the video games that we play, or the work environments that we're in, and the relationships that we're in. What are we allowing in through our five senses? What qualities do those have? And that awareness gives us the capacity to choose, right? So mindful movement in yoga then allows for somatic release of the issues in our tissues, a way to let go, or at least let be, so that not everything is clamoring for attention in emergency mode all the time. And those issues in our tissues are really what is a huge cause of plateaus, when you see your client getting better and then just level off or drop off, and every disease that we talked about at the beginning and more. And then self-care routines support more positive mental activity when we are not working in our practice, whether doing our homework or are in appointments. Mindful practices provide stability to get through the turbulence of recovery. A lot of people have courage after getting through a mild challenge, or some reason, some recognition that I've got to change. And we'll get a little bit of courage to stop smoking, or stop drinking, or cut down on drinking, or for a kid to just behave better and not hit, or not cut, or not better. And so of turbulence, that you start to lose faith in whoever is helping you, and drawn into back into whatever substances that make you feel more comfortable. So mindful practices provide more foundation to get through to this vortex of healing. So this is the last slide before we start some practices. Studies show an increase in the brain's production of serotonin, as well as a thickening of the brain, actual physical changes in the brain, the parts of the brain that produce more serotonin and more of the hormones that are the pleasure hormones that help us feel better. This also develops the functions of the prefrontal cortex, as I mentioned before. Empathy, language choice, and consideration of consequences are among those. Now, exciting time. Here we are finally at some of the practices. We're just going to do it for a short time, because 30 seconds of silence on a webinar is infinite. So, and I'll also expect that some of you have probably done these before, or some version of them. Really simple, doesn't make it easy. The first one is labeling sensory stimulus. So we're just identifying, am I seeing something, whether your eyes are open or if your eyes are closed? Perhaps you're seeing an image behind your closed eyelids. Hearing, either something coming in through your ear or your mind talking to yourself. And then feeling encompasses taste, smell, and touch. So if you are feeling the wind on your skin, or the air on your skin, air conditioning, or if you're feeling physical discomfort, pain in your neck, or remembering your breakfast and how it tasted or smelled, or anything in those, we're just going to say to ourselves mentally, see, hear, or feel for the next 30 seconds. And let's just take a moment, find an easy seat, elevate your spine or extend your spine just a little bit, and take a deep breath, and we'll begin. So again, labeling, see, hear, or feel. And return your attention back to your breath, and wait for the next sensation. 10 more seconds. Let's slowly, if your eyes were closed, go ahead and open them. By the way, I don't necessarily suggest closing your eyes. That is one way to turn your attention inward, but very often people with trauma have reactions when they close their eyes. They get hypo or hyper aroused. So that's not necessary. We will dive into exercise number 2 now. Labeling pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant sensations, thoughts, or feelings for the next 30 seconds. So similarly as the last exercise, we're just going to label, see, hear, or feel. That was the last exercise. This one is observing pleasant stimulus, neutral or unpleasant. So let's go ahead and begin. Finding your easy seat, extend the spine, take a breath, and begin. Get distracted into some thought pattern or other, just take a deep breath, return back to the present, and your labeling exercise. 5 more seconds. And take a breath, return your attention back to the present moment. Okay. So perhaps you want to just take note how either of those worked for you. I will say, especially in places like the jail, that these exercises are totally foreign to everybody in there usually. They always talk about how much better they're sleeping, how much better they have control of their emotions, and they don't just react as quickly, and how they're able to take a pause and respond and consider the consequences. This is huge in terms of keeping that thinking brain online and reducing the causes of further punishment in jail, and also reducing recidivism. Exercise 3, labeling mind traps. So this is more than just 3 things to label, and it might help to keep your eyes open, although I can see how that image on the side there might draw you in, but just to help remind you what each of the labels are. One is planning. So mind traps is just what catches our mind. Frequently, mind traps are traps because they're negative thinking, ways of negative thinking. Planning is not always negative. I will say that. But mind reading, how often do you catch yourself thinking, oh, that person thinks I'm so beautiful or so hot? Or I mean, perhaps, I suppose, but frequently it's that person's just being nice to me because they want my job. Or you think of, you have many different ways of applying that, I'm sure. Catastrophizing is going to the worst possible outcome. You could be mind reading a catastrophe too. So catastrophizing, parents are really good at this, thinking of the worst possible outcome that their child might encounter. We want to think of all possible outcomes, but catastrophizing is just going straight to the worst possible outcome and negating any other outcome. Exaggerating the negative would be a way, I suppose, of catastrophizing. Exaggerating the positive, think Edith Bunker, who is constantly making excuses for her husband's bad behavior. Being the eternal expert would be like someone who has difficulty taking responsibility. When you're defending, that is one method of being an expert. You know better, you are right, and that is the way it is, and everybody else is wrong. That's another way of blaming or shoulding. I think should is one of the more violent words in our vocabulary, and I would highly recommend not shoulding on yourself. Easier said than done, absolutely. So let's just embark on the next 30 seconds or so of labeling mind traps. So you might just notice 1 or 2 of them. catches your attention. Find your seat. Maybe your feet are on the floor. Lengthen your spine. Take a breath. And let's begin. Just observing your thoughts. Labeling when you catch yourself catastrophizing or defending. Mind reading. About 10 more seconds. Right. Slowly open the eyes. And we will maybe take note of any of those habits. And when we tend to be stressed is when those mind traps will be extra sharp and extra sticky, like a burr. So just something to be watchful of, and ultimately all of these, and go straight to that middle point, all of these things are self-care, and the regular practice when the stakes are low helps when the stakes rise. So stakes rise allows to take that pause to respond rather than simply react in a habitual way that perhaps we've been conditioned to do since we were very young. So self-care routines support the benefits of movement through the 5 senses in between appointments. I've said that before. And just a thought to put in your mind, we brush our teeth daily, well, most of us, but do we take regular care of our eyes and ears? Few ideas. Self-care 101 around morning, which can create our tone for the day, how we, whether we just have a rushed cup of coffee and run out the door after sleeping in a little bit, and that can set the tone for the day, right? And just like meal times, it sets the tone for the rest of the time period until we eat next. And night sets the tone for the quality of our sleep. So just a couple ideas to start you off in your self-care exploration or experimentation would be a recommendation of self-massage with oil in the morning rather than lotion, if you use lotion, for anxiety in particular. Oil is heavy, and our skin is fat soluble. So oil is fat, essentially. Lotion is water-based, which can suck moisture out of our skin and leave you more dependent on the product. So, but then you also might feel a little greasy. Not everybody likes that feeling. So you might have a hand towel that is your designated oil towel that helps to pat off the oil, or you might just shower before, or put oil on and then shower, because the heat will open the pores and some oil will go in and the rest will go off. It's nice to have a little buffer, like 5 or 10 minutes, if your house is warm enough to be able to, which isn't a problem so much in the summer, but in the winter it could be. You might also have a pair of clothes or a set of clothes that are your oily clothes that you wear while you're doing some stretching or breathing or meditating or making your coffee or breakfast before your shower. So that's just a couple of ways to do that. Or if you are feeling heavier in general with in your mind, like depression, or your clients are on the heavier side, you might suggest something like dry brushing. Dry brushing not only helps to exfoliate, but also helps to awaken the senses on the skin and get the body metabolizing and processing from the largest organ, the message to get started metabolizing. So that is one of my best suggestions for people with excess weight and or depression. Another is around meal times then. So meal times, I highly recommend eating at regular times of the day. Think of your acids and enzymes in your gut cooking your food. Just like, think of a campfire. So how do you keep a campfire going long as possible? Putting one log on every so often, about the same size. If you put the fire out and then load up a whole bunch of logs on, are you going to expect it to burn? Probably not so well. So you need to get the fire started again. And so eating at regular times really helps to support also digestion on the macro level in terms of our body, and all of the plaque that gets stored, all of the undigested material that gets sent to your weakest link, whatever that is in your body. This eating at regular times really helps your body to just take in a little bit at a time, and thus, same thing for experiences. You have more energy to digest and process what is coming at you in each moment. Another piece along those guidelines, rather than even suggesting a mindful eating meditation, which I absolutely do, but this is even before that, eating your largest meal at lunch and eating 3 hours before bed for best digestion. For most people, really, these eating guidelines are applicable to everyone. But what to eat is not always applicable. You know, when someone says, this is good for you, I always ask, good for who? Because what's good for some people is not good for others. We always consider for who, what, when. But eating your largest meal when the sun is highest is going to give pretty much everybody the best tool for digestion. And I'll also say for, again, people who have excess weight, one of my teachers mentioned a client who was around 400 pounds and couldn't integrate any other suggestion but this one, and he lost 100 pounds. So it can be tough if you're rushing in the middle of the day, but do your best to just let yourself eat whatever you want at lunch and eat a slightly smaller breakfast and slightly smaller dinner. And then at night, turning off mental stimulation about an hour before bed, such as turning off electricity, movies, even books, and instead use that time to journal, as in reflect, get all of the stuff that's happened to you out of your brain and out through your pen. You could also drink some warm milk, and I included nutmeg here because it is a nervine sedative, as well as being an aphrodisiac. Not that that's going to motivate you to try it, but nutmeg is what I do with my daughter every night to get her to go to sleep. It didn't work very well last night, but and then massaging feet with oil. Because it's heavy, it draws energy. Oil will be heavy, draws energy down and away from the brain. So when we're having difficulty sleeping, it's because a lot of the same thoughts are going over and over and over in our head, running around. And we need to just distract that energy, move it down and out, either through the pen or down to your feet with, I mean, who doesn't like a foot massage, right? Just use some oil too. Without oil can work, but oil, sesame oil, what you would eat. Organic sesame oil, organic sunflower oil, anything like that. Moving into now mindful movement and yoga. So conscious movement is a bottom-up therapy that increases the window of tolerance without needing to go into the client's story. And in 3 separate studies, this was since his book, The Body Keeps the Score. I saw him say this in a NICAM video, and he did 3 separate studies where he found yoga to be more effective in reducing symptoms of post-traumatic stress than any of the pharmaceuticals he studied. Now, he is one of the original Prozac researchers. He's been on the scene for a long time, and this is really groundbreaking. So even though there may be, yoga's history originates in India, it's not a religion, and it is extremely supportive in helping to reconnect people with their body, mainly because of the conscious breath. Also, heart rate variability is another way that people know that yoga works. It measures the relative balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems and marks susceptibility to other diseases. In a 2014 study, participants found that yoga improved heart rate variability, significantly improved arousal problems in those with post-traumatic stress, and dramatically improved subjects' relationships with their bodies, which is big when you consider that people who have experienced trauma, especially the significant trauma, the body has become the enemy, and they don't want to feel any of it, which is why we try to numb. So, moving now into some mindful movement practices for the last few minutes before we get into question and answer session. So, I'd like to invite you to sit near the front of your chair, and we're just going to go 2 levels forward. And the first is pictured here, relaxing the head forward. Actually, 3 go onto our elbows, which is not pictured, but just starting with me near the edge of your chair, sitting up. Taking a breath for hips, which proper opening around the sacrum and tailbone. We're going to take 3 breaths in each of these stages, tuning into the sensations in your neck and shoulders, perhaps relaxing a little bit more deeply with each breath. If that feels comfortable and your body feels ready to let go a little bit. And then we're going to slowly slide forward. Now notice I'm walking one hand at a time so that my back can stay as relaxed as possible. I'm going to relax my head and neck again. I'm just leaning forward onto straight arms. Try to soften your shoulders, soften the rest of your spine, soften your belly. Let yourself breathe into your belly. One more breath here. And this might be as far as your body is ready to go today. And if so, you can just stay here or move back to the previous stage. Or if you'd like to drop a little bit deeper, you can drop, notice I'm dropping 1 elbow at a time. I don't know if you can see. Tip forward just a wee bit. Screen, dropping down 1 elbow at a time. Keep the back as relaxed as possible. Now, Carrie mentioned I'm pregnant. Yes, everyone's pregnant. So I've got to keep my knees a little wider than you probably do. But just elbows onto the knees, and maybe if your neck is hurting, you can clasp your hands and lift your thumbs and rest your forehead on it. Not if your head is way up high here and it's hurting, maybe just go back if that's the case. But if your hands are able to stay at the level of your elbows, you can clasp your hands, lift your thumbs, and perch your head on them. Say 1 more breath here. Just tuning into the stretch in your body, your back and your hips. This is pretty easy to share with just about everybody. Slowly walking back, 1 hand at a time onto your knees. Take a breath. And slowly walking back until your shoulders are over your hips. Keep your head and neck relaxed. 1 more breath. And slowly rolling up. So I'm demonstrating these to invite you to practice them along with me. The next practice is a standing lunge. This is me at 3 months pregnant picture, and this is me at 7 months. Yes. So the standing lunge, it can be done with 1 foot forward and 1 foot back, just not on a tightrope. And the benefits of the first pose is really just a nice back stretch that you can do in a chair, at work, anywhere. Standing lunge, you might find that some of the benefits include stretching out the regions, the parts of your body that get shorter by sitting too much. So this is the psoas muscle that's stretching in the front of your hip as well as the hip flexor. The psoas is also one of the 3 primary muscles in your body that that hold onto trauma the most. They're deep muscles. Psoas, the pterygoid in your jaw, and the piriformis, which is in the rear. But this gently stretches the psoas. If your spine, then it's going to be decreasing that. So on the exhalation, visualize drawing your front ribs toward one another and thinking of a long lower back. And as you might notice, when one leg goes back and you start to lift the arms, these muscles naturally get tight. So you can leave them wide out like an airplane. You can leave them forward. You can leave them wide out to the side. It doesn't really matter so much. But these are working some of the larger muscle groups in the body. Let's go ahead and come back to center, just a nice, easy standing position. And then let's turn to the other side, or step the other foot forward, however you wish. It could be 1 foot separated, 1 foot forward, 1 foot back. It could be 5 feet apart. But ideally, maybe start with your hands on your hips to make sure your hips are squared in the direction of your feet. And square your shoulders in the same. And you can open your arms wide to the side, or forward, or up, whatever your shoulders will allow. And again, on the inhale, allow your belly to breathe. On the exhale, gently pulling your front ribs toward one another to keep that low back long. Working the major muscle groups. This is a fabulous pose to do with veterans in particular, especially because in yoga it's called warrior pose. So taking one more breath, and or whenever you are complete in that pose, go ahead and release. Move into the next posture, which you can come to for the next couple minutes while I go through the last couple slides. So I invite you to lie down and kick your legs up a chair. I will say one of the benefits of this is 10 minutes in this pose is like a 3-hour nap. In legs up the wall, it's a little trickier in terms of feeling hyperextension in your knees. You want to move closer to the wall if you're feeling hyperextended. Seriously, if you're just sitting in a chair right now, just lie down on the ground and listen. And you can place a blanket underneath each wrist to allow the upper edge of the shoulder blades to rest more flat on the floor, which allows for a really nice passive opening around the heart, and which allows more breath to come into your body a little bit more easily. Close your eyes or open them as you wish. And the lifting of the legs really helps to support a flattening of the sacrum and the grounding of the spine and the lengthening of the spine. You may have heard that we shorten ourselves. We sink into gravity by 1 inch or 2. We're shorter at the end of the day than we are when we wake up, and so this is a great thing to do beginning, middle, or end of the day whenever you need it, especially if you're short on energy and time. So if you are now thinking, if you work in an organization that you think, wow, maybe I should hire a yoga teacher who's near to me, I want to invite you to consider hiring a trauma-informed yoga therapist and not just any movement or yoga teacher, because most movement and yoga teachers do not know about adverse childhood experiences or why that is important. Most trainings teach styles that are too advanced for people who have injuries or been dissociated for much of their life. It can break a good tool before it ever gets used properly or therapeutically. Think pushing a beginner down a black diamond ski hill and expecting them to like it. Not really going to happen. Without knowledge of trauma, teachers may inadvertently trigger a student and have no idea how to help them recover. And many teachers will adjust or touch students without permission, sometimes without enough sensitivity, and cause injury, especially working with children. One of my teachers was telling me about how her 2-year-old son was being moved by one of their caregivers and dislocated his shoulder. And then the caregiver just thought, well, he's just making a big deal out of nothing. Stop being such a baby. Maybe didn't say that to him, but and the kid said, "Are you not listening to me because I'm 2?" Not every kid's going to have that presence of mind or words available. So I just really encourage you to keep your hands off. Trauma-informed teachers know how to start where the students are, how to meet them where they are, rather than pushing them too early. And the skill of a trauma-informed, and really any teacher, is to give them what they think they want and what you think they need, and how to balance that well. We know how to hold the safest space in our language and imagery that we use, and for all senses. So for example, if we are working with a group of people with food addiction, we might be very careful about the use of the word heavy or light, just for example. We know how and why to target which nervous system, and when to use what tools: mindfulness, chair, active or restorative poses, breathing techniques, or sensory self-care. And one brilliant thing about restorative poses like this that you see on the side here, restorative yoga uses props to imprint secure attachments such as blankets, bolsters, blocks, etc. Very helpful, especially for people who have not had a secure attachment in their life. And gives them the ability to not necessarily depend on you. So if we know how to use props, blankets, and such, we can take that home, and we don't need to wait for our next appointment to experience a secure attachment, even though absolutely healing comes from relationships in large part, and our relationship with ourselves might be the most important. So inspiration as we close our practice to fake it till we make it, to just start these practices, create time for yourself. That might be the most difficult thing you can do, is to just show up for yourself for a regular time of day, perhaps the morning, perhaps the evening, and just take 2 minutes and practice one of these things that you learned today. And a quote to close: as we begin to re-experience a visceral reconnection with the needs of our bodies, there is a brand new capacity to warmly love the self, articulately and naturally, not as a response to a should. We are able to experience immediate and intrinsic pleasure in self-care. In conclusion, top-down and bottom-up therapies are mutually supportive and work better together. Hormonal balance can be affected chemically or through diet and self-care practices like mindful eating and movement. The latter has far fewer side effects, one of which is happiness, but works much slower. Mindfulness, movement, and sensory self-constructive care routines all encourage slowing down, a positive attitude, and appreciation for life in each breath. So with that, we only have 5 minutes for questions, but I do want to open that up and just meanwhile give as you're formulating your questions, if you haven't already, invite you to sign up for my monthly newsletter at Holistic Trauma Recovery, and or contact me there to get in touch to see how I can help you in either teaching at your facility or doing a phone consultation, which I'll still be doing for the next couple months at least, and or arrange a training for your staff. So I'm open to taking any questions now.
Okay, Alma, do we have any questions from the group?
No, none. If they can raise their hand if they have a question. Well, one came up right now. Would I love to know how you engage adolescents in this work?
Invitation and trying to make it fun. And so very often kids come in with more energy than adults. Adults are very often crossing their arms and sitting back because they I wouldn't say have more trauma, but they have more imprints of trauma and being more jaded. So kids, although the work that I do, I have to say, with kids at Carice Youth Center is the hardest place I have ever taught. And that is, I'm still learning how to engage them. But I will say one technique, especially for younger kids, is using animal names of poses, which it's helpful to know a few more poses. But in general, just engaging with a little bit of movement, inviting kids to stand up and just be big and pick grapes, for example, inhaling with each breath, or swinging, just taking a little time to swing. That's really nice for an easy twist in the back. Or shaking. Shaking has been used for centuries, millennia really, as a trauma release technique. So movement is going to engage kids more than lying down, but usually after a few minutes of that, they might then be open to trying to lay down, but usually not for very long. You might get 2 minutes with them to lie down in the legs of the chair, but that's the skill, to be able to sense, are they ready for that?
There's another question. There's another question. I'm going to read it to you. Do you have lesson plans for children 0 to 5 or pregnant women?
Absolutely, and that would have to be either a consultation that I could share that with you, or another webinar. But generally, the lesson plans are best supported if you yourself practice and are able to model what you're doing. Kids 0 to 5, what I have found is just like taking them on a little journey from being a bird to being a frog, using those animal type things, and engaging their imagination is going to be the best. And you're not going to get a whole lot of response from a 1-year-old. Maybe a little interest in perking up and sitting up, and just body awareness, clapping their hands, doing opposite hands to foot, things like that, that just sort of coordinate the parts of their brain, help with brain development. Otherwise, more in-depth, we would probably need to meet for a consultation or a little bit longer time, since we only have 1 minute left. Thank you.
Oh, okay, I'm seeing this. First of all, I just want to thank Schuyler for just an incredibly informative. I don't know how many times you've all joined us on webinars, but this is the very first time that I've had a presenter that was not only willing, but requested to share her webcam so that you could see her, so that she could demonstrate things. So I hope that was really beneficial to you as a webinar participant. All of you will get an automatic evaluation at the end of this webinar, so we please encourage you to give us your feedback. It helps us make these webinars better. I will share this information with Schuyler. You can see the information about Strategies 2.0 on your screen. And yes, the webinar is being recorded, and it will be on our website in our webinar library. And yes, you will be receiving the PowerPoint slides. So with that, are there any further questions? And Schuyler, Fantastic. Thank you so much for all of your time and your hard work putting this together. We will connect immediately following this webinar. Alma will send us a number to call in, and we'll do a little debrief. But I want to thank all of you participants, and everybody have a great rest of the week.
Thank you, everybody, for your attention. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Hope to be in touch. Bye-bye.
Thank you.